Have a problem with the volume.
You can leave it there.
Okay.
If we have a problem, we will let you know because people online let us know. So we'll just make sure that you're close. All right. So if you're presenting, if you would make sure you introduce your name again for the people online, that would be great. Vice Chairman Van Kuren is perfect because he keeps on the time. And if you get a signal like this, that means you've got 5 minutes, and we're pretty good about keeping us going. So this will extend to 11:30, and then we will have a break for lunch. So with that, Representative, you are recognized to begin your study.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good morning, committee members. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the public for showing up, for those of you that are interested in this study. I did want to provide a little bit of a background of why I introduced this and what I'm really hoping to look at through it. So I think most of you probably know, at least the legislators in the room know, that I ran a bill this past session related to homeschooling. And it was recommended that because of it being the difficult issue to discuss that it is, that I maybe do an interim study to look into that. And to kind of give you some background on what prompted me to run that type of legislation is I work in juvenile justice outside of the Capitol, and some of the high-risk groups that we see that have the potential to become juvenile delinquents at one point in time are those that are truant from class, truant from school at a very early age or leading up to things. And so my program started to work with local schools to ask the question, what can we do as a court system to be supporting you in truancy and handling that and addressing that as an issue? And a lot of the schools that we spoke to said that there was not much that they could do about it, that they gave notifications to parents and families, that they had sanctions boards that they called them in front of to kind of not only provide services to help, but to put in some accountability in place. And that a lot of the times, unfortunately, families would choose to remove their children from school in that instance. And I hope that people know, especially the public knows, that it's not my intention with this study to attack the curriculum or to overregulate the system and implement testing or anything like that on the homeschool community. For me, it's really trying to find a way that when we're looking at this system, that we can find an appropriate approach to providing safeguards for our children. I end up dealing with a lot of children that are later in their teen years who, due to parents pulling them out of school and there not being any kind of systems checks or anything like that, that allow them to be neglected in some ways. And unfortunately, not just, physical, emotional, and that type of abuse, but also understanding that whenever I get them, there are times when they, even at 17, are not at a reading capacity. And so it's really, for me, not about trying to, again, implement any kind of curriculum or testing. It's just about trying to provide some sort of safeguard for our kids that are maybe not even really traditionally what I think we all consider to be homeschooling, but that are using the free system that we allow in Oklahoma in that area to be something that people use to just keep their kids at home and really not do anything with them. And so I'm hoping that my presenters today will be able to really kind of provide not only some more context to the issue, but possibly some recommendations that we can all move forward with as legislators to think critically and compassionately about what we can do to address this issue. So without that, my first speaker will be David Blatt from the Oklahoma Appleseed.
Good morning. My name is David Blatt, and I am the Director of Research and Strategic Impact for the Oklahoma Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. I want to express my thanks to Representative Swope for the invitation to appear this morning, to Chair Baker and Vice Chair Van Kuren, and the other members of the committee for being here today. Representative Swope gave me 3 questions that she was hoping that my remarks today will touch on. I'm going to try to limit them to about 10 minutes, and that should leave us 5 to 10 minutes for questions if members have. So the questions were, to talk a little bit about a new report that Oklahoma Appleseed has put out calling Making Court a Last Resort, Truancy and Chronic Absenteeism in Oklahoma. There are copies of the report for legislators. I have a few extra ones that I have. They're also available on our website at okappleseed.org. So first, I will talk a little bit about our report on chronic absenteeism. Secondly, I will give a little bit brief overview of the current laws surrounding compulsory education in Oklahoma. And then the third topic suggested by Representative Swope, any current oversight that you are aware of or lack thereof that addresses attendance or access for those who are homeschooling. So beginning with our report on chronic absenteeism and truancy, chronic absenteeism, as I'm sure everybody in the room today and those watching know, is a long-standing problem that has received growing attention since the pandemic. Now, chronic absenteeism and truancy are closely related but separate issues. Truancy basically refers to unexcused absences only, while chronic absenteeism includes absences that may be excused for health reasons, or if you are away for a funeral, or for other excused reasons. Our goal with the study was to explore how state and municipal truancy laws are being applied. And our principal finding, which of course we go into in more depth, is that there is tremendous variation and inconsistency in how truancy laws are administered and enforced across Oklahoma. To understand how truancy is going to be applied, it really depends on the policies and practices of each school district and prosecutor. So we found that in some jurisdictions and at some times, it can be a straight shot from a student missing as few as 5 or 10 days of school and charges being filed against the student and parent by a district attorney or a city prosecutor. In other jurisdictions, however, and at other times, charges are never going to be filed, no matter how many unexcused absences are racked up. So we were able to work with Oklahoma Policy Institute and their Open Justice Oklahoma project. We found that there were over 14,000 truancy charges filed in Oklahoma between 2012 and 2022. Now that only covers charges against adults in district courts. It does not include charges filed by city prosecutors in municipal courts. And there are over 24 cities with their own truancy ordinances. Those include Oklahoma City, Broken Arrow, smaller cities like Weatherford, Tonkawa, Yukon, Wowoka, and others. And that 14,000 number only covers charges filed against adults. There's no reliable data on the charges filed against juveniles over the age of 12. Our recommendations for the report, based on interviews we conducted with school officials, officials from the criminal justice system, as well as review of some of the extensive research on truancy, is that treating school attendance as a criminal matter is rarely productive or effective. What ends up happening is that you're hitting people with often substantial fines who are the least able to afford it. So there was a letter written by leadership of Tulsa Public Schools to Tulsa City Council in 2018 when they were considering a municipal ordinance that said, for many families that we serve, $250, which was the proposed fine for the city of Tulsa and is in fact the fine in a lot of municipalities, that can mean the difference between making the rent and being evicted. An ordinance that creates this level of monetary penalty would exacerbate family instability, creating conditions where students are more likely to miss school. An ordinance that has potential to increase negative interactions between young people and law enforcement could be a tragedy in the making. So instead of criminalizing absenteeism, we suggest schools should all be addressing chronic absenteeism through a multi-tiered intervention approach. Communities also need to be addressing the social and economic barriers to regular attendance, whether that's transportation, housing instability, food insecurity, or others. The court system may still have a role to play in the most intractable cases, but rarely and only as a last resort. So, second question, what are the current laws surrounding compulsory education? So if you go right back to the Oklahoma Constitution, Section 4 of the Constitution provides as follows: the legislature shall provide for the compulsory attendance at some public or other school, and here's the key phrase that you'll see repeated in statute, unless other means of education are provided, of all children in the state who are found sound in mind and body, this is the original Constitution, between the ages of 8 and 16 years for at least 3 months of each year. Looking at current statutes, and these have been consistent over the decades, so if you look at Title 70, Section 10-105A, it shall be unlawful for a parent, guardian, or other person having custody of a child who is over the age of 5 years and under the age of 18 years to neglect or refuse to cause or compel such child to attend and comply with the rules of some public, private, or other school unless other means of education are provided. So that same phrase from the Constitution is in Title 70 of statute. And then it goes on to say, for the full term, the schools of the district are in session or the child is excused as provided in this section. And then there are several exemptions for the compulsory education provision. Based on Attorney General opinions and court cases, the tests in Oklahoma for determining whether a private school or home instruction meets a requirement of the compulsory school attendance statute are that the instruction must be supplied in good faith and equivalent to that afforded by the state. So the Oklahoma Homeschool Association stresses that any parent who does not provide proper instructional program given in good faith and equivalent to the instruction given in the public schools will face criminal prosecution and be subjected to judicial scrutiny. And the State Department of Education states on the homeschooling page of its website that, quote, a point of the Attorney General's opinion is that homeschooling must not be used as a maneuver to bypass truancy. So this gets us to the third question that I'm going to address. Is there any current oversight that I'm aware of or lack thereof that addresses attendance or access for those homeschooling? And I suspect here my testimony will overlap with some of the others. So on its website, the State Department of Education recommends that you notify your local district that you're homeschooling your child to avoid truancy investigations. But the department stresses that this is in no way a requirement, a recommendation, but not a requirement. And the department stresses that, quote, home instruction should follow compulsory school age laws requiring children ages 5 to 18 to be enrolled in school. Homeschool setting should maintain compulsory school attendance as well. This would be the equivalent of 180 days each calendar year and 6 clock hours or 360 minutes per day as appropriate for the child's age. However, we didn't come across anything that would constitute oversight to establish that homeschool families are in fact meeting the compulsory attendance requirements in state law. OSDE clearly states that, quote, homeschools are not regulated and Oklahoma law does not require parents to register with or seek approval from state or local officials, conduct state testing with their students, or permit public school officials to visit or inspect homes. Now, we did come across anecdotal evidence that some families in Oklahoma are opting for homeschooling as a way to skirt compulsory education laws and avoid facing criminal truancy charges. So in the report, we note that the former superintendent of Woodward Public Schools, who I interviewed, he recounted that when he worked as an assistant principal, parents would get tired of fighting the school over attendance or discipline issues and withdraw their child to be homeschooled. The Coalition for Responsible Home Education, and we're going to be hearing from Samantha after me, on their website, they quote district attorneys and school officials in several states on how frequently homeschooling is used as a, quote, end run around truancy laws that otherwise risk dragging families into the criminal justice system. So according to the school superintendent in Rapid City, South Dakota, there is sometimes a movement for parents to come in, and as soon as truancy procedures start, they'll put in a homeschool application. All they've done is fill out an application, we've sent it to the state, and they become homeschooled, which incidentally is more than you need to do in Oklahoma, and that's all it takes in South Dakota. They quote the attendance officer for Kalamazoo County, Michigan, saying, "The homeschool law is abused up and down, left and right. You'll have a parent who is clearly neglectful and we can't get resolution, and they'll say, 'I've decided to homeschool my child and there's nothing I can do about it.'" So the obvious problem with using homeschooling as a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card for those facing truancy charges is that families whose children are experiencing serious enough attendance problems to be facing criminal prosecution are, in many, if not most cases, going to be families that are not best suited for successful homeschooling. If you're not able to get your kid to school on a regular basis to the point that you're at the risk of triggering a truancy charge, how likely is it that you're going to be able to provide them a consistent, pedagogically sound education 6 hours a day, 180 days a year at home? So how do we address the problem of homeschooling being chosen as a last resort for families facing criminal sanctions? I think the best answers are the kind of front-end interventions to address barriers to attendance that we discuss in our report. If we are able to do more on the prevention side, more to solve the barriers to regular attendance, if we can do more to build trusting relationships between students, families, and schools, do more to fund programs that make school seem valuable and worthwhile, then far fewer families may ever be in a situation where they're facing imminent criminal charges if their child misses another day or two of school. So that concludes my remarks. I am happy to answer questions about anything that I have addressed or didn't address on the topic.
Members, I will open it up to questions. Representative Lowe, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. And you started out your presentation talking about what the Constitution says about homeschooling. Are you proposing oversight by law as how that would be regulated?
We are actually not coming today with proposals. It is not a topic that my organization, Oklahoma Appleseed, has taken a position on. We are certainly going to listen with attentively and with great curiosity to what comes out of this study and what legislation may be proposed. But we have a bunch of recommendations regarding how to reform the truancy laws to hopefully avoid as many families facing criminal charges on truancy. We don't have a position on regulating homeschooling.
For follow-up.
Yeah, because I can tell you this committee has been provided recently some information that homeschool students test higher than public school students. Now, if you're starting to try to regulate, do you want us to regulate back to public school standards when they're already and we're talking about as a group, not individuals, because that's what we have to look at, because we don't regulate by individual, we regulate the overall. But why would we want to go to back public school standards when we're already seeing them test higher?
I don't want to be disrespectful to the question. Those are valid questions, but I'm really not here to take a position as to whether we should be regulating homeschooling or what standards should be used. We did do a study regarding our compulsory education laws, how those are applied or not applied. And I believe that was the reason why Representative Swope invited me today. And I told her that if I was asked to recommend, to speak to the question of regulation, that I was going to, cower in the corner and punt.
For follow-up.
Yeah, because I can tell you that we homeschooled at a young age our kids. And you're talking about what the SDE recommends and so on in there. I can tell you they were grade school students at that grade school age, and we were ranching, and there were just 2 students in that class, my 2 sons at that point. Yep. And by noon, they had everything covered. They were really good ranch hands after that. And so I came in to lunch, they saddled up, and I know one presenter knows both of these boys and been very successful. And, if you go by the recommendation, well, they have to be in so many hours and so on, that didn't fit at all. Didn't fit at all what their education level is. In fact, when they went back to public schools, they were almost a year ahead. And so, there's always recommendations out there, but I think you have to look at it on an individual basis. And when we do things, it doesn't become on an individual basis in there. It becomes an overall standard. So do you think that there is exceptions to all aspects of this?
Speaking individually, I think there are definitely situations where students receive an excellent homeschool education. I think where we would have concerns, and we spoke to it here, and again, I don't have legislation in mind to address it. Your situation was not one where the student was unable to attend public school or private school regularly, was facing a truancy charge, so you pulled them out and, makeshift last minute attempt. That I don't think is going to be in any student's interest. But are there students for whom homeschooling is a good, maybe even the best choice? Absolutely. Are there students, for whom homeschooling doesn't work? That is also the case. But that really isn't what I'm able to, speak to as an expert.
Representative Provenzano, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to make sure I understand the scope here. It is not the entire homeschool population. In particular, I think I'm hearing a narrower parameter of those students who are in public school but are at risk of being turned over to the courts.
Right.
And then because they have missed so much school for whatever reasons that are unexcused.
Yeah.
And that smaller population is who your comments apply to, who then withdraw their students?
I think those are the situations that would be of most concern. And I suspect that the next speaker with the Coalition for Responsible Homeschooling will likely speak to that as well, because, we did come across some educators who did speak to that kind of a situation, where if somebody is facing imminent truancy charges, they will withdraw their child from school. Some are sending them to a virtual school or an alternative school, but some are choosing homeschooling. And for some, that may be the right call, and the parents are going to be well equipped to provide them a quality, effective homeschool education. I think the concern would be if this is being done simply to avoid criminal charges, and the family, never intended to homeschool their child and doesn't have the resources. Very often when children are dealing with attendance problems, it's because the parents are dealing with too many things going on in their lives already that they can't get their kids to school on a regular basis. It's not clear that many of those parents are really going to be well equipped to step in and, homeschool during a semester after a student has accumulated 10, 15, 20 absences. So those are the situations that would concern us the most. But I don't, I'm not coming in here saying here's the legislative language that's going to fix that. I think it's difficult, and I think the best thing the best solution is to try to avoid, the front-end interventions that would avoid many students getting close to that threshold where criminal charges are imminent.
All right, final follow-up, and then I'm locking the queue for one question with John's because we're running a little behind. All right, for follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a point of reference, how has chronic absenteeism changed post-COVID pandemic?
How was what? Which was?
Chronic absenteeism.
Yeah, so the numbers are way up almost everywhere. We see nationally chronic absenteeism rates have gone up 10, 15 points, and that's the case in Oklahoma, although we're a little lower than the national average. I know there are some school districts where as many as 40 to 50% of the students are chronically absent, some schools where it's even 70%, and that's missing 10 days of school over the course of this. It's 10% of school. So that has been a real issue, and people are studying it to try to understand why chronic absenteeism is going up. I know this is a top concern for many school districts and trying to come up with the right solution. And our hope is that the solution is not to come in with criminal charges and court cases and fines and jail time. It's really to try to work to address barriers keeping students from attending regularly and succeeding.
Representative Johns, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is probably more of a statement than a question,
Okay.
but as a assistant principal at Ada Junior High, part of my duties were to get kids to our truancy court. And just a point of reference and information, I know our judge, if they were going to pull them out to homeschool, then he required them to come back the next month, because we only just had it once a month, but he would require them to come back the next month with enrollment papers, et cetera, to make sure that they were indeed following up on their homeschool. And then at that one, he would then assign them the next month to bring documentation of how they're progressing in that homeschool before he would dismiss those charges.
Which county was this, or which?
It's Pontotoc County.
Pontotoc, okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blatt.
Thank you.
Representative Swope, you're recognized to present your next guest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to make a few statements, I just wanted to reiterate, we're really not trying to make an apples and oranges comparison to homeschool versus public school. It's just looking at what safeguards we can put in place to, as Representative John spoke about, make sure that there is actual action taking place to educate kids and not just nothing happening. So my next speaker will actually be Samantha Fields. She is the Government Relations Director for the Coalition for Responsible Homeschooling.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Representative Swope, for inviting me, to the chairs and committee for attending and being willing to engage and listen on the subject. I have a presentation. Come on. There we go. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see my screen now? Okay, good. Okay. So just introduce myself a little bit. I am Samantha Field. I was homeschooled myself. I am the Government Relations Director at the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. If you're not familiar with us already, we are a national nonprofit that is founded and run by former homeschooled students, because as we became adults and started having children of our own and started making educational decisions, we realized that there were some patterns among homeschool policy that deserved to be addressed. So I am familiar with Oklahoma policy. I've worked a long time with people who grew up in Oklahoma, who were homeschooled themselves, who are now homeschooling their own children in the state of Oklahoma. So I'm hoping to just kind of give a big picture look at what Oklahoma policy looks like, how it compares kind of nationally, and also what are some of its vulnerabilities. So in current Oklahoma policy, as my colleague already addressed, Oklahoma does not have a homeschool specific statute. The only thing that kind of references it is State Statute 7010-105 that makes reference to an other school. So that means that Oklahoma homeschool policy, as it's currently derived, is from court decisions and an attorney general opinion. There's two court decisions, but one from 1957 is most applicable, Shepherd v. Oklahoma. And that was in the case of a truancy case. And that decision found that it's on the state to prove that no other means of education are provided in order to pursue any kind of truancy charge or other violation of compulsory education. But that doesn't mean that state of Oklahoma was prevented by these decisions of seeking or requiring such evidence. And most of how homeschool operates in the state of Oklahoma now is kind of under the guidelines of the 1973 Attorney General opinion that said that so long as the private instruction is supplied in good faith and is equivalent, in fact, to that afforded by the state, which doesn't mean that they have to get the same thing as state testing or do those kinds of assessments. Currently, that's not what's happening in Oklahoma, just that the attempt is being made, especially in cases of chronic absenteeism, truancy, other violations of compulsory education. So it is unusual for a state not to have any kind of homeschool statute. Most states have something specifically referring to homeschooling, defining it at least in some limited way, which means that for families who are just starting to homeschool in Oklahoma or are relocating to Oklahoma from different states, that they may arrive in Oklahoma, and because there's no clear guidance, that they're going to get different answers based on different school districts, different state and county level education departments. And as we see from that example from Hunt County, different processes involving how to resolve disenrollment from a public school, etc. Oklahoma is one of only 11 states not to have a universal enrollment policy. It is unusual even in that 11 states not to have a homeschool policy at all. For example, the state that I reside in at the moment, Michigan, doesn't have an enrollment policy, but they do have a homeschool statute. On top of that, half the country does have more than just an enrollment process. They have some basic attendance or subject requirements, being like, okay, you have to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. It doesn't define what that would look like, what curriculum you have to use, what standard you have to educate it to, just that it's present, you're making the attempt. And beyond that, many states also do have some kind of periodic assessments. It's extremely rare for states to have a reporting requirement that the student has to take the assessment and then the assessment is given over to somebody to review. That rarely ever happens. There's only 2 states that actually do that. So Oklahoma is very much kind of a Wild West when it comes to homeschool policy, as it doesn't have anything, and it can kind of be a little bit legally confusing for people just starting out. The unfortunate reality is that because of that very nebulous, undefined gray area, it means that the policy is vulnerable to exploitation. I want to make it clear that I am not making statements about whether or not home education is a good option for Oklahoma's children, or how well homeschool students do in comparison to other kinds of maybe more traditionally educated students. This is not about saying homeschooling is better, homeschooling is worse. That's not what I'm here to talk about or argue. I'm just here to point out the ways that people who are acting in bad faith, who have no intention of actually homeschooling their children or being home educators, can abuse the current policy landscape. So it's important to recognize that isolation is one of the most significant risk factors in the presence and escalation of all types of abuse: intimate partner violence, elder abuse. All kinds of abuse and neglect are worsened the more isolated a victim becomes. The size of a victim's social network is correlated to whether or not they can be discovered and whether or not somebody can intervene. And also, the more time a victim is isolated with their abuser, the worse the abuse can get. That's why in intimate partner violence, the abuser will seek to cut them off from their family, from their friends, to isolate them, make sure that there's no one around for them to reach out to talk to. And children are especially vulnerable to this kind of community isolation. So what we see kind of nationally as we look at homeschool cases, we do see patterns. And it's important to note that when 11 states don't even have enrollment, it's very, very difficult to make sweeping statements about what homeschooling is or isn't, or how well homeschooled students do compared to others. But as we find cases that are reported on the news that become public reports, of the very minimal data that we do have looking at homeschooling, when we analyze 24 cases in the last 24 years, at least 31 homeschooled children have died in those cases after being withdrawn from school. Students are often withdrawn from school to be homeschooled, not really what we would consider homeschooling, in order to frustrate or end completely a child abuse investigation. So we see that in chronic truancy and in other types of abuse that might have been reported via mandated reporters through the school, through administration, through contact with their community. So the parents realize that, oh, these reports are being generated by my child's exposure to mandated reporters through school. Teachers are noticing bruises. They're noticing concerning behaviors. They're noticing signs of child sexual abuse. And I don't want anybody to notice this, so I'm going to pull them out of school. Cases in our database involving withdrawal from school are significantly more likely to involve prior social service history and systematic abuse consistent with torture, as well as higher fatalities. We're not just the only person reporting this. There was a Office of the Child Advocate in Connecticut looked at various counties across the state of Connecticut and found that when children are being withdrawn from school to be homeschooled, a full third of the time, it's in order to shut down a child abuse investigation. What's important to note is that homeschooling usually comes after, like the idea of homeschooling, the popularity of homeschooling, or the creation of a homeschool statute comes after the implementation of child abuse protection policies departments. And that is true in Oklahoma. Oklahoma created a child abuse awareness initiative, set up agencies to kind of prevent child abuse. And then homeschooling in the 70s and 80s became much more popular of a thing. And the unfortunate reality is that homeschool policy tends to break the foundational assumptions at the core of child abuse protection statutes and makes those statutes obsolete. Those statutes usually assume that children are going to be in contact with their community and that abuse will be able to be discovered. Homeschooling policy breaks that assumption by giving abusers the ability to completely isolate their children from reporters, from people who could discover the abuse. So 148 known cases involving homeschool policy. So this is a situation where a child was, for better or for worse, under a home education statute, are of extreme abuse that meet definitions of torture. And Oklahoma is not immune from that. I can offer more like case studies about abuse that's been discovered in Oklahoma, that abusers were exploiting the homeschool policy in order to torture their children. It is truly horrific. I can't even begin to describe some of the cases that are in our database. It's just things that would shock you. 61% of cases, even of the cases that we do eventually discover, 61% of cases are discovered either too late, when the victim is already dead or will die in hospital, or due to accidental circumstances irrelevant to the victim. The parents were spotted out somewhere, just it's very incidental, it's very haphazard. In known cases involving homeschool policy where there is an abuse report generated, 82% are generated by a non-professional, which is very much non-standard. That's not typical. Most of the time, abuse is spotted by people who are professionally trained and mandated to recognize and report abuse. 31% of known cases involving homeschool policies involved someone making a report. That means most of the time, no one made a report. No one was able to discover the abuse until it's too late. Most were discovered incidentally, meaning there is no routine to discover abuse and intervene. There's no process in place, there's no check. So alongside of that, children do have an affirmative right to an education. As my colleague mentioned, Oklahoma actually calls that out. Every single state constitution in the United States does contain an affirmative right for children to have an education. And nationally speaking, the U.S. Supreme Court has held for over a century that the state has the obligation to ensure children are safe and they're actually receiving an education that prepares them to function in their society. Again, I'm not making comparisons about which one is better, just that it is something that Oklahoma has the power to do, to make this differentiation between people who are actually homeschooling, who are homeschooling in good faith, who actually want to do that for their kids, and people who are abusing the system. According to various Supreme Court decisions, including Pierce versus Society of Sisters, Mayer versus Nebraska, Prince versus Massachusetts, states can have compulsory education laws like Oklahoma's. And they're also empowered to regulate all schools, not just public schools, but also private schools, non-traditional schools, online charter schools, all of the various different options that exist, especially post-pandemic. We're seeing a lot of different ways for school to happen. States can require instruction in specific subjects, especially English, that the instruction take place in English. They can require teacher qualifications, such as you have to have graduated high school, and require assessments that measure student progress. I am not making recommendations about what Oklahoma can or can't do or would be willing to do, just that there is a difference between good faith home educators and people who are abusing the statute, and Oklahoma is empowered to make the distinction legally. So according to the Constitution, provisions shall be made for the establishment of a system of public schools which shall be open to all children of the state, and the legislature shall provide for the compulsory education at some public or other school, unless other means of education are provided, of all children in the state. In my opinion, these two statements in Oklahoma's Constitution means that the Oklahoma legislature has an obligation to make sure that all children are at least enrolled, that there is at least enrollment, that at least compulsory education laws are being followed. At least there's some attempt made in order to discharge this responsibility. So I think just the existence of public school isn't enough to meet those constitutional obligations, that even if they're being educated at other schools, they still have the opportunity and power to make sure educational needs are being met. and the legislature has the legal authority to update homeschool policy. Some may argue that based on Shepherd v. Oklahoma or Attorney General's opinions that the legislature doesn't have the power, but we have many legal experts, people who are homeschooled, people who aren't homeschooled, people who are very well informed on education policy in Oklahoma, and the legislature does have the authority to create an enrollment policy and enrollment process. So we do have some recommendations for Oklahoma, and again, we're not saying this is not about assessments, this is not about determining who is better at what, but we do think that an enrollment process would be helpful for the homeschool population, for people who are relocating to Oklahoma, who are more familiar with an enrollment process elsewhere, and for people who are starting to homeschool in Oklahoma and are going to their school district, and the school district says, I'm not sure what you're supposed to do. An enrollment policy would give new homeschool parents to Oklahoma the knowledge that they have dotted their I's, crossed their T's, everything is on the up and up. They know exactly what they were supposed to do, and they did it. Also, it is important to create some kind of legal distinction between homeschooling and truancy. Right now, there's really not a ton of legal difference between what counts as homeschooling and what is truancy. Would someone who is trying to escape some kind of investigation or court contact due to truancy, would they just then be able to enroll homeschooling and then have the same problems that we were talking about before? Yes, that would still be true, but there would at least be a formal process. We also believe that as part of creating an enrollment process, that we prevent those of convicted crimes against children or those who have lost parental rights from homeschooling. This exists in Arkansas, in Utah, in Oregon. There's a few places that take this stance. And we do feel that this is a minimum, that people with a history like this are at greater risk for abusing children, and the more isolated those children become, the greater the risk. So if someone has already proven that they abuse children, or if a court has said this is too much, you have lost parental rights. We do have records of people who have lost parental rights being a part of a homeschool, and in states that did have enrollment policies. So we know that that's something that does happen in other states, and we could prevent it. We also think that a system that if you have been reported for abuse, that you cannot just immediately pull your children out of school, that the investigation has to be concluded. We do think that this delay should be able to be appealed to a judge to make sure that there's a system in place in case there's an abuse by any individual worker, administrator, et cetera. But that is the most vulnerable time that we've discovered from all of the data in other states from a national level. That is the time that a child becomes the most vulnerable, is they're being abused, somebody notices the abuse, they make an abuse report, the parent is trying to end that, and they will pull their children out of school. Usually what that means is there's no ability to therefore prove that any abuse was happening. Proving abuse is very often takes a lot of evidence and contact and ongoing contact with people who can see what a bad faith actor can do abusing the homeschool policy is they make sure that they cannot acquire abuse, that the child cannot be seen, that the child cannot be interviewed, that they just can disappear from all public life. And as we have seen in our database, this usually results in an increase in abuse and an increase in the lethality of abuse. We also want to support our homeschooling community and make sure that all children can access what their educational needs are. For example, the Federal IDEA Act says that every child, regardless of their education background, has the ability to be assessed for learning needs, learning disabilities, autism, ADHD, et cetera. And that's true in Oklahoma, but there's no funding in Oklahoma for those children to then access any kind of special education resources. So we would love to see homeschool children have access to those kinds of resources, access to part-time enrollment in school, if they want to do math at school and reading at home, if they want to do sports, to have access to those kinds of things, have access to hearing checks and vision checks, perhaps the vaccination days at school, et cetera, to have access to those kinds of resources and to those kinds of community support. I hope this has been helpful in kind of laying the groundwork for what homeschool policy looks like nationally and what we feel would help homeschooled children and people who are not homeschooling but exploiting the homeschool policy as it currently exists. Thank you, and I can take questions now.
Thank you for your presentation, and in the interest of time and to honor Representative Swope's itinerary, she has reserved Q&A for the end of her presentations.
Okay.
So I will give you the floor to introduce your next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I appreciate that. I have tons more to say, but I think I'll just get on to my next speaker for the next issue, just to save us some time. So without that, I have Joe Dorman, who is the CEO of the Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy, speaking on the state perspective of this.
Thank you, Representative, committee members. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. This is a topic that OICA is approaching from the health and well-being standpoint. There are many organizations that work on the education side of this with curriculum, making sure that the level of education is appropriate for students. We're looking at this as a way to make sure that children are healthy and their welfare is considered in the best interest. I'm hitting all the buttons. Now, if you, all right. There we go. So, forgive me for not citing the source on this. This was a map that was pulled from a national pro-homeschooling site to show the differences in the states where the laws are at. And you can see from this, Oklahoma is one of several states that has very limited regulation when it comes to any part of homeschooling. From the website, you will see options for homeschooling. There's one option that's considered. The school required for ages 5 to 18. Notification is not required as far as the intent to homeschool. Teacher qualifications, there is no standard that is outlined. There are no state mandated subjects, no assessment requirements, and immunization requirements are not allowed for any of those. Next, I want to show something that's already been discussed, and I apologize for the small font, but you do have in your program, or in the handouts from Representative Swope, these are shared, and I do believe that this will be posted by House staff for anybody online who would like to go back and see this later. These are the guidelines that are listed by the State Department of Education, taken verbatim from their website. Laws have been interpreted by the Attorney General to allow for the education of a child in the home by a parent guardian with the following guidelines for home instruction. These recommendations are not required by law. However, following these suggestions would allow a parent to prove they are providing a quality education. And so you'll be able to read through those. And this continues on to the next slide. Homeschools are not regulated, and Oklahoma law does not require parents to register with or seek approval from state or local officials, conduct state testing with their students, or permit public school officials to visit or inspect their homes. Now, from the perspective of the concerns that should be considered, there was a state committee that met several years ago. This topic has not been discussed through official state entities for several years, but the last time that a committee was formed, these were some of the concerns that were brought up and some recommendations that were brought forth. Unlike children who attend public school, children who are homeschooled are not seen regularly by mandatory reporters such as teachers or support staff, and I will even throw in church members. Oftentimes, some individuals who use the guise of homeschooling have the worst intentions. Sometimes their children are used in sex trafficking. Sometimes they are just completely isolated. And I'm going to talk about that is the vast minority of children. But the fact is, it is still happening. And so these individuals are ones that give the homeschooling community that has the best interests in the hearts of their children. These aren't the people that should be aligned with the definition of homeschooling, but unfortunately, with the way the laws are put in place, they use that as a ruse to be able to pull their children out of any type of setting where there's any adult outside of the family has any contact with them. Oklahoma, I will also point out, has no requirements as far as grandparents having access to children as well as other family members. That's a conversation that's been happening for years as far as other family members having the ability or the right. In Oklahoma, there is no right for grandparents to have any contact with grandchildren. Isolation is a known factor for abuse. While most homeschooled children are not socially isolated, and I would say that is the vast majority are not socially isolated, there are currently no protections in place for those who are. Parents who homeschool have a complete control over who their children have contact with. This may include isolating children from grandparents, as I'd mentioned, or other relatives. Children who do not attend school often lack access to social or school district resources, as was mentioned by the previous speaker and with Representative Swope, for health and wellness, such as medical and disability screenings, meal programs, and athletic opportunities. I will point out, I do believe that there is conversations regarding the Tim Tebow law with the legislature to look at the opportunity for homeschool children to be able to participate in school athletics and other programs. From the perspective of OICA, this provides an opportunity for those children to have that direct contact with mandatory reporters and does provide the opportunity, at least, to ensure that those children are safe and taken care of. I have no concerns about those families because those are the families that are doing the best job with homeschooling. They're the ones you hear about, just as was mentioned with the statistics Representative Lowe mentioned. These are the children that are performing highly and them that have the opportunity to participate in an organized extracurricular activity. We're not going to see the ones that we're worried about, the ones that are being isolated and the worst intentions with their parents being carried out. If you'll flip over to the next page, these were the recommendations of the Post-Adjudication Review Board that met many years ago for strategies for addressing issues related to homeschooling. Every year, the State Post-Adjudication Review Board develops a list of recommendations to improve the juvenile court system and child welfare systems. This list is submitted to the Commission on Children and Youth on May 1st of every year and also serves as a list of priorities for the State PARB to address. In 2019 and again in 2021, the State PARB created a subcommittee to explore ways to increase safety for kids that are at greater risk for child abuse and neglect due to community isolation. Specifically, children that have an encounter with child welfare are being homeschooled and are in danger of community isolation. The committee was called the Kids Who Are at Risk Due to Community Isolation Task Force. The committee did come up with 3 recommendations before disbanding in 2021. For their first recommendation, engage the homeschool community into the community isolation and child safety issue. Bridge the relationship to the homeschool community. Develop a tool or resource for homeschooling that is given to parents when they withdraw from schools, public schools, to start homeschooling. And ask homeschool organizations to voluntarily reach out to the parents that have recently started homeschooling. We saw this as certainly a wonderful recommendation in providing that resource for those homeschool families, for those parents that made this decision, to let them know that there is a community out there, that there is a network, and it is a wonderful community. Those of us who have served have been here on homeschool day when many families come up here to visit lawmakers and share their stories. Again, those aren't the ones we're worried about. If they're bringing their kids to the Capitol and sharing these stories, they're doing this the right way. They're the ones that are sharing the stories about how successful homeschooling can be. The ones we worry about are the who knows what percent it is, because we truly don't know how many homeschool children there are in the state of Oklahoma. There's some that are slipping through the cracks, and I'm going to conclude with some of those. But we have to come up with a way to make sure that the homeschool community has access to the resources that are available, and let those families know that there's a network. My sister chose to homeschool her 3 children, and in turn, her 3 children chose to homeschool all of their children. All of them have turned out wonderfully well and successful products of their education and in the community. They have used that homeschooling community and network to work together to provide those resources, oftentimes in a collaborative effort, bringing the children together and having one teacher teach a lesson, and then they rotate through those. It's a good system that has worked for many of those children. And I can attest to Representative Lowe's children, because one of them paged for me when I was in the legislature. And honestly, I thought he was going to run against you, and he would have beat you if he'd have run against you. For recommendation number 2, increase identification of abuse. And this is a topic that goes back and forth in our minds on how to handle this. So going through their points, promote the use of the child welfare hotline, such as creating a marketing plan to increase the reporting of abuse to keep kids that are homeschooled safe. Ask child welfare to do a follow-up home visit if there is a concern about homeschooling. Child welfare can visit a home up to 60 days after the child is withdrawn from school. However, the investigation is closed if no abuse is identified. Create or tap into a database of kids that have dropped out of school and have not signed up for another school. I know this causes concern for many homeschool families, but the fact of it is we have seen issues where families have pulled their children out and have not had the best of intentions. In Piedmont, several months ago, there was a family that pulled their 2 oldest children out of school and brought them home. No issue was known about. The first sign was when the oldest child, a teenager, ran away from home and reported the parents for abuse, that they were using the 2 older children to raise the 2 younger children while they were doing family duties. There was no schooling happening at all. And the only way this was found out is because one of the children broke out of the house and went and reported it. A few weeks after that, there was a situation where a child was pulled out of school in South Oklahoma City. The teacher became worried because of some of the history with the child and reported that. The police did show up. There was an armed standoff with the father, preventing law enforcement from coming into the home. Once it was resolved, it was discovered, yes, the child was being abused and the situation was there. These are 2 situations. Those are some of the drastic situations, but the fact of it is these are things that are happening, and there is no way that the state has a way of checking up on these kids other than simply calling in a report, and that's just suspected abuse. There's no guarantee because the children are being isolated. On recommendation number 3, potential legislative action or rules changes. These were recommended by the committee. Homeschool parents are not allowed to make changes to an education plan for a certain number of days. That would involve what's going into the cases of child abuse and neglect. If there is some type of situation where an investigation is happening, or if there has been a report, the parents shouldn't be able to pull the children out of school to hinder some type of investigation involving the families for child abuse and neglect. This shouldn't be a tool used to prevent the welfare of the child being considered by simply withdrawing the child from school. An annual assessment of what was studied, curriculum in the home over the last year, over 12 months. I believe this was recommended for the homeschools associations to come together and offer reports for this, so at least the State Department of Education would be aware of what is being taught in many of the homeschool collaborative efforts, just to ensure that the children are being kept at a grade level appropriate, which is required by law. Make the homeschooling form required and standard statewide. That would just simply be created a standard form for universal for filling out the yes, we are withdrawing our child, the child will be homeschooled, just simply for having that uniform standard so it will be known by the school that the child was being withdrawn by a legitimate homeschool family and with the intention of educating their child at home. Now, I want to follow up with some of the issues that we want to encourage. Over the past several decades, organizations across the country have instituted child protection policies. In recent years, churches have joined this trend as well, instituting background checks and other child abuse prevention measures. Homeschool communities, too, should have child protection policies in place. There are also other ways homeschool groups or co-ops can promote child welfare, such as encouraging healthy parenting and providing children with abuse prevention education. Suggestions include institute child protection policies, using the OSBI background check for any of the individuals that are working with cooperatives, just to ensure that your children who are in a cooperative school setting, that it's known that the person that will be working with your children has been cleared of a background check. Educate healthy parenting and healthy families, and then hold trainings on child protection and other topics. We would certainly encourage those cooperatives that are out there working to homeschool, come up with a policy that helps to make sure that you avoid some of these situations. Next, you've already heard from the Coalition of Responsible Home Education, but I wanted to throw some of their statistics out. As I said, the vast majority of homeschool parents are doing the job of educating their children. Despite that, there are incidents of child abuse. The 2014 study found that 47% of victims had been removed from school to be homeschooled, and a 2018 study looked at 6 school districts in Connecticut found that 36% of children removed from school to be homeschooled lived in families subject to past child welfare reports. Of those children, 90% lived in families subject to multiple reports or to reports that were determined to be founded. In Oklahoma, many recent cases of child abuse and death have shown that children were not in a school setting. And these are just some of the final points I wanted to bring up when it comes to child abuse. Physical abuse, verbal and emotional abuse, confinement and food deprivation, isolation of totalistic families, sexual abuse and exploitation, identity-based discrimination, discriminating against a child because they might be of another race, medical neglect, withholding identity documents, and trafficking and missing children. And if you believe a child has been abused or neglected, the hotline is 1-800-522-3511. OICA worked about 3 legislatures ago with lawmakers to shift the mandatory reporting laws. There was an issue in schools where teachers were not reporting immediately to the hotline. They would report to the administrators. And sometimes the administrators would not follow forward and report that themselves. The law was changed thanks to the wisdom of lawmakers that were here in the building about 5-6 years ago to require that no matter the situation, every Oklahoman is a mandatory reporter. Whether you work for an entity that doesn't want you to report or you may even question it, the law says that you are a mandatory reporter, and if you suspect child abuse and neglect, you are to call in the situation. I want to close just talking about how we each care about our districts. I think there's no question every single lawmaker has a deep affinity for their district. There was a young child named Athena Brownfield that died in Surreal, which was my district, several years ago. And if you remember the case, the parents, one was in jail, one had turned the child over to another set of caregivers, the 2 children. A postal worker found one of the children wandering the streets of Surreal and called it into child welfare. They showed up, did an investigation, discovered there was a second sibling, a sister, who was missing. An investigation turned up that that child was dead and later found in my hometown, which is about 30 miles away from where the death likely occurred. Yes, that is just one incident. But I would ask, how many child deaths does it take for us to do something to make sure that these bad faith actors using the guise of homeschooling and keeping their kids out, we do something to ensure these kids are protected? I don't know what the answer is. That's y'all's job now. I hit my 12 years hard time and turned out. But we're here to work with you on this to try and come up with solutions to make sure those children like Athena Brownfield are protected, and that these horrible human beings that have a special place in hell for doing that to children, that we do what we can to reduce that situation. So, Mr. Chairman, hopefully I caught you up a little bit on time, and I'll stick around for questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Representative Swope, you may introduce your next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. For my next and final speaker, we will have a woman named Melissa Coast. She is a lived experience person. She has had the pleasure of homeschooling all 3 of her kids here in Oklahoma. So she's just kind of here to talk to us about what that experience has been like, and to give anything that she's seen that she thinks might help, and hopefully help answer some questions anyone might have. All right, without further ado, go ahead, Melissa.
Hello, everybody. I am, like she said, I've been homeschooling my kids for about 15 years, I believe. My youngest is finishing his senior year of school, so I've almost successfully homeschooled all 3 of my kids. So I guess just to share a little bit of my experience in homeschooling and in the community itself, and just how I feel as a citizen of Oklahoma caring for all the kids that live here. It's been a really wonderful experience homeschooling, and I appreciate the fact that there is a lot of freedom in Oklahoma to homeschool the way that I want to homeschool and provide the education that I think has made my kids amazing children. And I don't, however, it's been challenging in certain instances, and there are things that could have possibly been helpful to me along my journey, but obviously some things would have had to been in place to make those happen. So like we're talking about just being able to work better with public schools and with the education that Oklahoma is providing for kids, it would have been really cool if the relationship between homeschool and public school was better. It would have been nice if we could have worked together. And I understand that, to be able to do that, you do have to have some regulations. You do have to have some rules and laws set in place to make that work and make it safe. And I would have appreciated that, having that support and being able to support the public school as well. It would have been nice to have a working relationship with them throughout my years of homeschooling. I also, I've understood some of the regulations they're talking about and some of the things that are being suggested. Most of them I don't have one problem with, and I actually think it would make the homeschool community stronger. I like the idea of, if you're going to homeschool your kids, you should probably pass a background check. And part of that is because I feel like we just naturally, when you homeschool, there's going to be groups that you can join. Sometimes they're religious groups, sometimes they're non-denominational groups, whatever. But there's all these different homeschool groups to join and partner with. And it's wonderful to be able to pull all your resources together as parents, and different parents have different expertise, and being able to let all your children benefit from that is amazing. But I don't recall there being any kind of safety standard whatsoever. I don't know if any of those parents were background checked or not. I don't know if there was ever any child protection training, which would have been great. Just in our personal life, we've done a lot of traveling, and a lot of, my husband was a pastor, a traveling pastor, basically speaking at different church camps across really the whole United States. And there was always some rules set in place just for even the week that we were going to be present there, that all of us needed to go through child protective training, meaning we understood how to spot abuse. We knew how to report it. We knew what to look for. They also had rules in place of who could be alone with a kid, that type of thing. And even in Scouts, we also had those rules too. And we also did lots of background checks all summer long because every camp wanted them. And that was just a very, I think, bare minimum way to just ensure that the adults around the kids are safe people. And I don't think it's a far stretch at all. I mean, churches are doing this. Like it was mentioned earlier, that churches have put these programs in place. Other places where children gather, Scouts, church camps, other organizations also have some kind of way to ensure that the adults around these kids are healthy and are not a risk. I like that. I would like to be able to participate in a group where I at least know that the best effort has been done to make sure all the adults in the room are safe people for my kids to be around. I like that. I think that would be helpful, actually. And I also think that would lend to being able to work with public schools, too. If your homeschoolers are vetted and you can work together, I think that would be really cool. the other part I just kind of wanted to briefly talk about was this idea of even just noticing and having some way of enrolling your kids, saying, hey, state, I'm homeschooling my kid, and having a list of kids that are homeschooled. I also I support that, because I don't like it when kids fall through the cracks. Now, I know that most of the homeschool families I've met, actually pretty much all of them, were all really good people. They did a really good job educating their kids. They cared. They spent lots of time preparing and planning and working with other families and doing it right. But that does not mean that there are people that don't exist that are letting their kids fall through the cracks, and their kids are falling through the cracks, because there's absolutely no way to know where they are, if they're being educated, what's happened to them. Does the school district even know that kid's name? I don't like the idea of kids getting lost in the system and it being very easy to be abused and mistreated. And I think it's worth me having to fill out a little piece of paper and maybe doing a little bit extra work on my end to ensure that all the kids are accounted for in Oklahoma. I care about all the kids, not just my homeschool kids, not just my homeschool friends. I care about the public school kids. I care about our public school teachers. I care about all of them, and I want them all to succeed. I would love for our education system to be better in Oklahoma, and that's not the reason I chose to homeschool. That was for other reasons. But I feel like there's got to be some kind of answering to and accounting for it. If you're going to keep kids safe, you have to actually know where they are, and you have to know where they are. So I think most of the homeschool parents I met do care about these things, and I do think there could be a little bit more education on our side, understanding what abuse looks like, how to report it. I do think that needs to be more obvious, and something that's maybe given to, like you were saying, if you register to homeschool, have all those resources boom up front. Here's how here's a video on child protective training, and here's how to make sure your kids are safe, other kids that you see in other groups are safe, any other group you're going to participate in. If you're going to participate in a public school sports setting or something, here's how you can also pay attention to these kids and make sure they're safe too. I just really like that, and I don't think there's a problem with it. And I really love the idea of stepping closer to this idea of homeschool and public school being able to work better together. I think the homeschooler families would benefit, and I think public schools too, and I think teachers would benefit too. And that's really all I got to say.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the information that you gave us. We appreciate it very much. At this time, I will recognize Representative Swope, if there or any other representatives that might have questions. That is your last presenter, correct? Yeah. Any questions from representatives? Representative Rosecrans, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair. Let's go Chair. I like the sound of that. Anyway. Thank you for having this study. I don't know who would ask this question of all the presenters, but from what I can tell, this is not what I had a lot of folks reach out to me angry, and this is not what I expected. This seems common sense. So can you help somebody here? Can somebody help me understand why somebody would be angry about what we're presenting today?
I can definitely try, and if any of my other presenters have anything to add, then they can jump in as well. I think that the anger or maybe the concern there comes from people conflating maybe homeschooling and this specific issue that we're talking about. Like a lot of the presenters spoke about, it's not really necessarily about the homeschool population. A good majority of those people are doing the right decision for their family, and they're doing it well. There are plenty of instances where that's the best choice, whether it's disabilities or bullying, like you spoke about in your first study. This is about people that are using the current setup as an exploitive measure. And so it's really not meant as an intent to attack or, like I said, overly regulate the homeschool population. It's just about addressing these individuals that are using that nefariously and that are doing it in a way that isn't actually providing for education or anything. It's just not tending to their children.
For follow-up.
Thank you for that explanation. And I'm going to ask maybe the homeschooler that, sorry, her name.
Melissa.
Melissa, sorry. This is Representative Rosecrans, Melissa. I have had, I'm a former public school educator, and actually I also think that our public education system needs fixed. I don't want to kill it with vouchers and things like that, but I want to kind of open it up, less red tape, those types of things. More play, more recess, less testing, all that kind of stuff. Would you agree that's one of the reasons why you decided to homeschool your kids as well? I'm just trying to get a feel for, because I have a lot of homeschoolers in my district as well. Is that kind of similar, or what was your decision-making process?
Sure. Yeah. No. Part of the decision really was because we wanted to do more traveling as a family. My husband traveled for his job, and they really weren't getting to see their father very much. And we were very loaded down with school. And this is when my son was in kindergarten, first grade. He went to kindergarten, first grade in public school. My oldest did. And so our decision was based really on the fact that we could take our education with us anywhere we were and be able to travel, and also use travel as part of education. So it was more of an enriching type of education that we wanted to be able to provide our kids and do it together as we traveled. Yeah, the things that I saw in public school that concerned me, and as I'm not saying this as like a way to deal, like I truly feel like the teachers that my son had did their very best. They were good people. There were lots of good people in the public school system that I got to be friends with through the PTA and the leadership there. But there was a lot of overcrowding and a lot of not enough support for the teachers. And it led to it being a very strained classroom, a very full classroom. There were things that teachers just didn't have time to teach because there was just too many kids to try to teach it to them. And so some of those were also the reasons of like, I could also just focus on those things with my kid, the things he struggles in, I can just focus on those if it's just us, doing our homeschooling together. So it was similar to, really, truly the main one was being able to travel and take our education with us and not have to be in an actual classroom to do that. We could do that anywhere. And the other part would be that, I felt like the public schools were stressed and overwhelmed, and it's not something that I could fix in a day. So those were the main reasons that we homeschooled.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Representative Lowe, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. And I'm probably going to make more of a statement and then we'll end up with the question, if you don't mind, because it appears to me from all of the presenters, the big issue here is safety and abuse. That's what we're really talking about, is safety and abuse. However, some of the recommendations that came from different ones appeared to me to be proposed being more invasive on all homeschool families, not just handling that safety and abuse aspect. And so with that, I don't disagree that there is some problems out there with isolation and some other aspects. I'm just not sure, and this is the question, is the Educational Institute the right way to address this, or is there another way to address this safety and abuse? I'm not sure this education aspect is necessarily the right avenue. Would you agree? And I'm asking you, Representative.
Sure. No, I appreciate the question. And I really do think that was kind of my intent of this study. I think a lot of what came up when I ran the bill was not only is this state agency the best agency to be doing it, is there a different state agency that this type of oversight safeguard should be put in place? Is it something that should be a legislative change that you and I deal with, or is it something that an agency could put in administratively through that process? Is there something that we could do as far as court requirements coming out of abuse cases, like one of our presenters mentioned earlier about, I think it was Representative Johns who mentioned that the judge required there to be follow-up, that there was something taking place. And so I'm not coming to this telling you that I have the answer. I'm just trying to open up the conversation about what is the best way for us to try to be addressing that issue.
And Representative, I agree with Representative Swope. I'll point out, this is something that's...
This is Joe Dorman speaking for those online.
Sorry about that. I just figured people recognize my voice. I would argue that every child in the state already goes through this. By signing up for a public school, you're already basically saying yes to this. This is looking at all the other kids in the state. And yes, if we could find a way to isolate the probably 1% of bad faith actors from the 99% of good in the homeschool, we wouldn't even have this conversation. We would already know who the bad people are. But I just want us to come up with something workable, and I would love for this to come from the whole homeschool community themselves. Figure out a way to police yourself, and if there are bad faith actors, but we know they're not even schooling their kids in many cases. With the Brownfield case, they weren't teaching that kid. They just were hiding the child. I'll point out there was a case in Rush Springs, I guess it was about 5 years ago. I keep going back to my hometown. I do want people to know it's a lovely community, but there was a child who was attending public school, special needs child, who the child was with 4 adults in a home to the west of Rush Springs, and a welfare check was done on the child in February. There were issues found, but not to the level of abuse or neglect by law enforcement and the child welfare worker that showed up. A couple of months later, a teacher called in a child welfare report because the child had told the teacher that the child was being chained to a radiator. The child was being urinated on by adults in there. They were sticking the child with pins and recording it just to torture the child. So yes, there are problems in homeschool, or there are problems in public school when reporting doesn't happen. And I would argue that child would have been much better off if the investigation had been a little bit more thorough up front, or if it would have happened early on. So this isn't just a homeschool situation, but thank God for that teacher calling in that report, or who knows if that child would have lived.
Are there any other questions from our representatives? All right, I recognize Representative Swope for some closing remarks.
I'll try to keep it short because I know we ran over and I'm the only thing stopping people from going to lunch. But I just wanted to, again, thank the legislators that attended today or that are watching online. Thank the public for showing up and for being concerned about this issue. And of course, again, many, many thanks to all of my presenters that were willing and able to come be present today and to talk about what is a very difficult issue to navigate, I think. And that's it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the presentation, for the interim study, for our presenters for being here. And that concludes, I get to hit one of these because I am vice chair. That concludes our interim study. We will be back here at 1 p.m. for a interim study on new accreditation rules.